right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Earnest Talks. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're about 3 past the hour. I see some folks still logging in, but I think we'll go ahead and start rolling. Hello from New York. Welcome. I'm your host, Michael Maloof. I'm the head of marketing here at Earnest Analytics and the leader in consumer and healthcare data for companies and investors. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce Cameron Alverson. He's a senior director of media and analytics at Living Spaces Furniture. Cameron's been in the analytics space for nearly 20 years. He graduated from college when he was 18. Amazingly, he studied journalism, political science, but not really what he was expecting to do with his career. So the opportunity for analytics kind of came up and was compelling for him. Basically because he got to tell stories with data. And he's been telling stories at agencies and some of the world's top brands like Dell and Walt Disney. As the senior director of media and analytics at Living Spaces, he was picked to lead the team responsible for the entire paid media budget and performance analytics as the company expanded nationwide and is still expanding. So I have one note here: as much as he loves, data and analytics, few things he loves even more include s'mores, 5 kids. So thanks so much for having you on the show. Cameron, I'm going to start with a quick question, and then I'll let you kind of go from there. But it's been a wild ride for home furnishings in the last 3 years. First, supply chain challenges during COVID, the explosion in demand from home office furniture. Now we're seeing some sales deceleration after what Dan McCarthy and Shin Oblander described as demand pull forward in a recent Earnest Talk, actually. Of course, there are a lot of outliers in the category. It's a huge space. The thing that we really want to know here is, what's next for home furnishings, and what are folks in the space doing with data to get there? So we're going to discuss how Living Spaces is moving past pandemic trends, expanding in new markets, and how specifically Cameron's team uses Earnest transaction data to inform new store openings and a lot of other decisions. So Cameron, welcome. And can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and about Living Spaces?
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. I think the bio there is probably as much as you need to know about me. The Living Spaces Furniture is a furniture retailer. We started in LA about 20 years ago and have been expanding outward from there. Pretty aggressively this year. We've got plans to open in 4 or 5 new markets. By the end of the year, we just opened in Salt Lake City, our first store, a couple of weeks ago, and we've got our first store in Oklahoma City opening next week, actually. So even in this more depressed environment, we've got a lot of growth on the calendar that we're really excited about. Living Spaces is somewhat unique in the value propositions that we bring to the marketplace in terms of just what the customer experience looks like, where basically the furniture that you can buy from us, it's almost all going to be in stock. We can deliver it within a few days. The salespeople aren't commissioned, so it just what we offer is really an easy and a friendly environment for people. And during the pandemic in particular, especially the in-stock value proposition was huge for us, and it was a real differentiator. So we're excited about what we see on the future here, and as we look forward and the kind of growth that we expect that we'll be able to continue to see over years.
Awesome. Yeah, it's really a helpful niche when no one could get a desk or a chair. So I'm curious, you mentioned growth and new markets. What role is your team? What do you have to do with opening new markets, and what kind of data sets are you using for that?
Yeah. So my team is responsible for media strategy and then also performance analytics. So there's a whole set of decisions that get made about which market and exactly where in the market that my team doesn't get involved in. But once that decision has been made, then my team is needing to make decisions with data on what is our media strategy going to be, and what are the opportunities specifically for our brand in this market that may be unique and that maybe require a different approach. And if you think about it, as we look market by market, our media strategy in a market like LA, where we've been for 20 years, will necessarily be different from the media strategy that we'll have in Oklahoma City next week, where no one has heard our jingle and it's not stuck in their head yet. So those kinds of decisions are the decisions that my team is making. There's a variety of data sources that we use. Of course, the earnest data is one of those, and we'll look at just some of the available data around what people seem to be doing from a media perspective, as much as we can glean, as well as just what the consumers look like in that market, and that will help inform really what my team decides to do from a media perspective, and what kinds of plans or budgets that we propose up to leadership would be most appropriate for the market.
Got it. You mentioned a lot of different data types, specifically when you're looking at new markets with transaction data. What's the main use case for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, an easy one for us, I think, is really understanding the competitive set. So as we go into a brand new market, we have a feel for who our main competition is going to be and where consumers are going. You can see that just by driving around, just by looking on Google Maps, easy things like that. One of the things that the earnest data gives us, though, that we don't really have full visibility to otherwise, is regardless of what sort of a media presence a company may have, how big are they? Like, what kind of an influence are they really having in a marketplace? And that has uncovered for us companies that we ought to be paying attention to and keeping an eye on, where otherwise we might not have, just based on media spend. And there are ways that companies can spend on media that maybe would go under our radar with other data sources that are available. But when we can see what the revenue is coming in relative to some of the other companies and relative to just the overall market, that certainly gives us a feel for how much to pay attention to certain companies, and then to really dig in on, well, what are they doing, and how might we need to respond as a result.
That's really interesting. So you're turning to Earnest essentially for a little bit of the real market sizing outside of just what the market looks like, or how much one brand dominates the airwaves or something like that. I'm curious if you've been in any markets or new markets recently where like a surprising market player, or someone really you did not expect was someone you ought to be looking out for.
Yeah, I mean, in some of our recent markets, we've noticed because the earnest data is relatively new for us, and so using just the older methodologies that we would use to understand the competitive landscape, there's some of our newer markets where we had our eye on, okay, here are the couple of key competitors, and here's what they're doing. But then in looking at the earnest data, it uncovered that there was another competitor or two there that we weren't fully aware of, or weren't aware of how big they were and how influential they were in the market. And that's then required us to kind of rethink, well, what kind of media then might they be doing, and how ought we to respond? I think one of the other things that the earnest data has done for us very recently that we didn't really have a good way of getting to before is, as we've gone into some unique markets, we just went into Salt Lake City, which demographically is a unique market with some key differences. We looked at what some of our competitors were doing. Some were closed on Sundays, for example, and we wondered, is that something that ought to impact how we think about our media, and how we think about just what that environment looks like, or what consumers are expecting. And we were able to use the earnest data to look at what revenue looks like for the category by day of week, which uncovered some very different trends than what we're used to seeing in most of our other markets, which then has led to some different decisions that we would make in terms of media, led to a lot of internal discussions about what our store hours ought to look like, and whether they ought to be different in that market compared to others. So it was earnest data that really began to uncover some of those kinds of opportunities for us that we didn't have any other good way of being able to see before, without it being really kind of like a gut call of, well, I don't know if some competitors are doing this, should we follow them, or is there hazard in not? And the earnest data really started to uncover some of those opportunities for us.
Can I ask if you are allowed to share, are there any interesting tweaks or adjustments based on how you operate in other markets that you made for Salt Lake based on the data?
Well, so one of the things that we noticed was that Salt Lake is by itself really a very unique market. And I mean, it led us to really start to look at some of the other markets to see, especially the newer ones that we're going into, to see if there were any sort of patterns like that that we might not have naturally assumed would be there. In this particular case, I think Salt Lake is a bit of an outlier, and maybe in other markets that we go into, we'll find that there are others that are similar to it. But the change in buying behavior by day of week in that market seems to be pretty unique, at least compared to other markets that we are in.
Yeah, that's a really interesting use case of just drilling into markets, seeing exactly what makes it unique, what part of your strategy does and won't work there, what other folks are doing. Obviously, you're pairing this data with a lot of other data sets. Most people are. Can you speak to how transaction data interacts and informs some of your other data sources? For instance, is there anything you can do with transaction data you can't do with legacy data like surveys that helps build that data mosaic, or vice versa, places where you need to start with earnest, but the ultimate decision is probably going to have a lot of different data sets involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think from an analytics perspective, there's this constant tension between qualitative and quantitative data and how those two ought to interact with each other. This, I think, is a good example. The Salt Lake City example, I think, is a really good one, actually, of how quant and qual can inform each other and create this virtuous loop of analysis. So seeing in the hard data and in the quant data behaviors and trends that were different than what we expected informed, for example, qualitative data that we would go and try to get. It informed surveys or questions that we wouldn't have thought to go ask, but that then we went and asked in the market to try to understand and really validate what else is going on here. The thing with quant data is it does a really good job of telling you what happened, but not necessarily why. And the qualitative data does a good job of telling you why things are happening and what some of the motivations are, but not necessarily whether those are things happening at scale. And so you need that combination to really, I think, get a holistic picture. And this is, I mean, this applies beyond living spaces. This applies anywhere that I've been. But that Salt Lake City example, I think, is a really good one of, we saw something in the quantitative data that indicated there's some more research to do here. We need to figure this out more. And then that informed what a survey ought to look at. But it goes both ways. We'll do surveys or focus groups or whatever kind of consumer research, and it will likewise inform analysis that we ought to do that we wouldn't have noticed otherwise. So we'll have consumers who will say something that triggers really a question for us, and we'll go and dig into whether it's earnest data or, depending on what the question is, there may be other data sources like web traffic or like store traffic or whatnot that we wouldn't have thought to look at otherwise. And then we find that there is a story hidden underneath more aggregated trends, and it was hearing direct from a consumer perspective, for example, or some other sort of feedback that we get that maybe isn't statistically significant, but that raises those questions and really leads us to start to interrogate data in a different way than we would have thought to otherwise. So I think that's one example, and that's those two categories of quant versus qual. But the earnest data, I think, also provides us an opportunity to get a more holistic picture from that quantitative perspective too, because it layers in a view that we wouldn't have with other kinds of data. We can see whether it's website trends or whether it's trends in what our own foot traffic or our own sales look like. But earnest data, I think, and this for us, I think, was one of the biggest use cases that led us to bring it on board. The earnest data allows us to put all of that in some kind of context. We just came out of a period that, it's no surprise to anybody, was a period of historically high consumer demand for furniture. It's a safe bet to assume that almost everyone listening bought furniture during the pandemic. And now we're in a period that, it's no secret, is a little bit lower than it was over the last 2 years. And so looking at our own performance, whether it's growth or whether there are areas that maybe year over year are not quite as strong as we would have liked them to be, being able to use things like earnest data allows us to put that into perspective to say, well, is this what we would have expected? Is this what everyone else is seeing? Are we doing better than competitors? Does that mean we're still taking market share, even if this metric is not quite, what we would hope it would be? And, from that perspective, I think also helps us in terms of forecasting, in terms of not just understanding how to evaluate current or recent performance, but also looking forward and trying to project, well, if these are the things happening overall or happening to specific competitors of ours, then what might we predict is going to be happening for us? And we've certainly been able to use the earnest data to see where there have been overall trends during the pandemic or coming out of it, where our trend has not quite lined up. Maybe we saw a trend a little earlier than maybe the rest of the market did, or a little bit later than the rest of the market did. And that's really important context for my team as we evaluate whether our media mix, whether our media strategy is working, whether we need to make tweaks to it. So I think there's a lot of value there, but it comes down to knowing what questions you need to ask, and that would give you information that you can actually go act on.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think circling back to one of your points, internally, we think of the idea of perfect recall data. We think of the Net Promoter Score as kind of being the antithesis of that, is like the ideal world, maybe aspirational sometimes number that you're getting, whereas the earnest data is more the perfect recall of what people actually did. But yeah, perfect recall, you're right, has one big flaw. It doesn't indicate intent the way Net Promoter Score or surveys do. So I think this is a use case we actually see pretty commonly with a lot of folks in seats like yours, of pairing this data with kind of like surveys to explain the why. I did want to circle back. You mentioned that one of the main things you do is use this data to give your numbers context. Living Spaces, private company, a lot of the furniture brands, private companies, no public metrics, certainly not by market. I'm curious what metrics you're most focused on. Is it sales? Is it customer acquisition? Like in the furniture space where people aren't buying a new sofa every week, what's most important to you?
Yeah, well, I don't know that I'll be breaking any news here. I mean, we pay a lot of attention to those basic business metrics, of course, right? And we can use the earnest data to understand not just our own revenue or our own number of transactions and what those trends look like, but also then what it looks like for the overall market. The company has been from the beginning, and I think it's one of the things that makes it very unique, has been very, very grounded in data. A big piece of what makes us successful is the use of data throughout the company, and not just with media, but in terms of just understanding, supply chain and inventory and what sales should look like and whatnot. And so it's not an odd thing for the company to be looking for other data sets and to be trying to put things into context based on that overall data. So I mean, there's the revenue and the transactions and the store traffic, of course. But then the other thing that I think is really important for us, and you kind of hinted at it, but because they work hand in hand, is some of that upper funnel recall, awareness, brand perception sort of data. And it's really important to us to know not just are people buying from us versus competitors, but to understand how do people think about us? Do people know about us? And for my team in particular, that drives a lot in the decisions that we make about what kind of media to deploy or for the creative team what sort of messaging needs to go into that media. So there's plenty of surveys and consumer research that we'll do, and these kinds of things will come up. Using the Salt Lake City example, that was where we went and commissioned some specific consumer research to really try to dig into some of those trends to understand how should we respond to these things. And I think keeping our finger on the pulse of the consumer requires both of those, both looking at those upper funnel business metrics as well as those more lower funnel business metrics.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Put in marketing speak, it seems like this is more tracking towards the end of a customer journey or the kind of the completion of becoming a customer, whereas the surveys and the more qualitative data is really focused on that top of funnel or beginning of the customer journey.
Yeah. And it's the kinds of things to focus on are going to be different by industry, of course. The buying cycle for furniture is going to be very different than the buying cycle for a box of cereal. And that we have to uncover using data, what does it really look like compared to maybe what we think it looks like, as well as then going and monitoring that to see, well, where are the points that we can influence? If we can understand what that consumer journey looks like, what that buying cycle looks like, if we can understand what the normal frequency or what the normal triggers are that would lead to consideration and purchase, then that really informs what our strategy ought to be from a media perspective for sure, and allows us to really hone in on those opportunities, those moments that are going to matter the most. If I were to tomorrow be transported into a CPG company, I could not bring with me the same media strategy as we use for furniture. Of course, there might be some of the analytical methodologies that we would carry over and would be the same, but the findings and then the application will be very, very different. So with furniture, it's not the sort of thing where people are going and buying every week or every month or every quarter or every year. And it's really important then to understand, well, what triggers that? When do we need to get in front of people? And then how long of a window do we have? Are they in that furniture buying process for days, for hours, for months? Because that's going to impact what we decide to do in terms of how to target and when to target and with what kind of messaging. Understanding things like, if someone comes and buys a piece of furniture from us today, does that mean they're done? Or did they just get started and we need to stay in front of them? There are multiple data sources. Earnest data certainly allows some of this to understand what that buying cycle looks like. And if we don't bring in that third-party data, then we're limited to only what transactions look like within our own walls. But if somebody buys something from us today and they're still in the market for some other complementary piece of furniture perhaps, and they're willing to go buy from somewhere else, we won't know that unless we bring in third-party data. And we won't know whether that continuing purchase process, if it exists, whether that continues for another 6 months. To use an example, like a specific example, if we had a retargeting campaign, for example, where, I don't know, if you were to display a certain behavior on our website, we would decide to follow you with ads, a common marketing method. But if we were to do that, we need that kind of data, that kind of understanding of the consumer journey to know when to stop or when to change the messaging. If you came to our website looking at sofas and then we stopped serving you any ads once you bought a sofa, A, you'd probably be relieved that we weren't still showing you sofa ads. But B, are we missing an opportunity to then sell you on a coffee table? We can't get that data with just our own in-house data. We have to make those decisions based on what we can glean from that broader transaction data that includes our competitors, that includes third-party data that we don't otherwise own.
Yeah, I really like that theme. And just for everyone in the audience quickly, we'll be taking some questions. If any of this is brought up, any questions for you, there should be a Q&A box. Please write in. We'll try to get to them towards the end here. But to kind of summarize and then I'll lead you to the next theme. So it sounds like what you're describing is you are tracking your share of wallet once they've been acquired and seeing how to expand it. And if that wallet itself is growing through things like repeat furniture purchases as an entire category, and just typical like where furniture stands across categories. I'm wondering, Ernest Dash does include like a macro kind of view, right? You can sum up all of the merchants into a category and track the share that customers are spending in just that category over time. Are you using macro applications in your seat, or does your company kind of see macroeconomic applications with this data?
Yeah, no, 100%. And not just with this data, but with a few other data sources as well. It's critical for us to understand and kind of anticipate where it seems like consumer demand is and is going. There's a certain amount of seasonalities, a certain amount of predictability in furniture, as I think that there is in most industries. And COVID really threw things off, and to understand, are we getting back to what are kind of normal patterns and normal seasonality? Is it more depressed? Are there certain times where it's more elevated? I mean, all of that is critical for us to understand in order to make informed decisions. Otherwise, what we'll end up doing is just kind of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what's going to stick, or just guessing based on what we saw happen last year or whatever. But I mean, you can imagine, given the historically high consumer demand over the last year or two, if we were to make decisions this year based on exactly what happened last year and assuming all the same stuff was going to happen this year, we would be very inefficient. We'd be making all kinds of mistakes and pouring money into all kinds of the wrong places. So yeah, that sort of macro view is critical for us to understand those trends and to understand how they're shifting, and to understand if they're changing, if they're rebounding, if they're depressing. I don't know how else we could do it if it wasn't for that sort of a macro view and of that macroeconomic environment. One thing that Ernest has done for us that we've not been able to get anywhere else is really a quantifiable view of what the impact of inflation has been over the last year, and to see not just how it impacts us. We know how it impacts us. We know what our own costs and prices look like as a result of it, but to understand, how is it shifting things for competitors? How is it shifting things from a consumer perspective? And you mentioned share of wallet. How is it shifting things in terms of share of wallet? The pandemic changed dramatically from our industry's perspective, changed dramatically what share of wallet looked like. And now as we come out of that and inflation is high and there's whisperings of recession or just downturns in the economy, that also has huge implications for what share of wallet means. And we're able to monitor and quantify that with this kind of third-party macro data that otherwise we would be completely blind to.
Yeah, I think share of wallet's a pretty third-party data only use case, I guess. I'm curious, can you speak to any of the actual trends you're seeing in share of wallet with the inflation and post-pandemic effects?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think this will be revelatory for anyone, but what we saw during the pandemic with people unable to pay for services because services weren't available and instead paying for goods. I think that the story of this story will feel very familiar for a lot of listeners, which is now suddenly they're working from home. They're not commuting into the office. They have savings that they had planned to use to go on vacation or something. Now they can't do that. They're looking at this sofa that they've been meaning to replace for years, and now they're staring at it all day long. And they say, you know what? I'm remodeling. I'm going to finally pull the trigger on this thing. I've got the money to do it, whatever. That meant that for furniture as an industry, but then just, related categories as a whole, you saw share of wallet really expand where we've never really seen it before. Now, with inflation, it means that you see this pinch because people still need groceries, but those groceries are taking up a larger share of their wallet. People still need gas, but the gas now is taking up a larger share of their wallet. With fuel prices on the rise, just overall, utilities and whatnot, that's now they still need all of those things at the same level, but now it's costing them more. As a result, things like furniture just necessarily have to take a smaller and smaller share. That's all I think kind of predictable and logical, but you can't really quantify it unless you're pulling that data in. And being able to quantify it allows you to say, well, is this a disaster? Is the floor falling out from under us? Or are we just looking at a depression in demand? The size of the pie is shrinking, but the pie is still there and it's still huge. Which of these is it? And you can't tell that unless you're looking at that sort of third-party data. The earnest data really helps us to understand that. We'll look at things like, Google's got their publicly available trends data, and we'll look at things like, search trends for furniture and what that looks like. And that gives us a good feel also for just how how top of mind is this for people? Are people really searching at the same level as maybe before the pandemic? Is it different now? And what's that volume look like? Is it zero now? Or is it still really high, just a little bit lower? Being able to quantify these things has a huge impact on making decisions about, well, then how much should we budget toward media at all? Should we turn it off altogether, or should we, keep it pretty strong and just reduce it a little bit? Like these are critical decisions that maybe feel like they're just mathematical or kind of trivial, but they have a huge impact on what it is that my team in particular ends up doing.
Yeah, that was really interesting. So how do you compete for a piece of a pie that might be shrinking right now?
Well, I think a number of ways. From a market, I've spent almost my entire career on the marketing end of things, and one of the things that I noticed, especially working at agencies, is that the marketing budget, when things are tight, is almost always the very first thing that gets cut, and cut a lot. So that's a common reflex, I think, and resisting that impulse is, I think, one of those keys, making sure that we're leaning forward while everyone else is on their heels. And that takes a couple of forms, and I think media spend is a piece of it. But there's a lot about it that comes down to also just kind of the company DNA. Can we remain really disciplined, and can we remain just really tied to our core principles, even when the consumer demand is low and so it feels like we're being stretched and everyone else is doing one thing or another? Can we resist some of those impulses? So I'll give you an example. At the beginning of the pandemic, like everyone, all of our stores got shut down for a couple of months. Well, store sales are a big part of our business, and we went all of a sudden to being an online only retailer. That's not how we're set up. That's not how we've built ourselves. That's not what we think our future is. We think that brick and mortar stores play a really, really critical role in furniture. But because the company had been really disciplined in financial decisions that they had made leading up to it, even while stores were closed, we didn't lay people off, and we didn't cut salaries, and we didn't turn media off altogether. We made some cuts. And then once we saw that there was opportunity, we quickly reinvested in order to just stay ahead of things. I think that kind of discipline, goes beyond. I mean, in some ways, that kind of discipline comes from being able to just rely on data and just using the cold hard analytics instead of leading with your heart. And that's easier said than done when it feels like there's an emergency. But that's a big piece of it. I mean, honestly, like if I had to say what the secret sauce is, it's that, like, we can stay disciplined. And and that takes a whole bunch of forms. So at the end of the day, I mean, we use our data, we try to understand market by market where the opportunities are, where that low-hanging fruit is, whether it's from a media perspective, whether it's from really emphasizing certain value propositions that our brand has that are in high demand and that maybe competitors can't speak to as well. Whether it is, opening up in new markets, which, as I say, is not my team's call, but that certainly is a piece of it for us as well. There's a lot there, I think, that goes into how is it that we continue to win, even if the overall industry is feeling a little bit of a pinch.
Yeah, and I think more information is always better in that fight. So thank you so much. You did an incredible job answering my questions. I really appreciate it. We are going to take a few more questions and then we'll let everyone go for our 1:45 planned end. The first question for you, Cameron. So when you look out from your media seat and analytics seat, what advice would you give to someone basically just starting to look into third-party data, learning what's out there, trying to decide what data sets they should leverage? Anything about kind of your process?
Yeah, so I think from an analytics perspective, one of what I've observed is one of the most common and tempting problems is as you bring on data, data is very sexy. It's very attractive. You want a whole bunch of it, but I think a lot of organizations make the mistake, and I've been in organizations where this mistake has been made, to bring on data faster than you've got the ability to do something with it. And so I think there are two things here that are maybe top recommendations for me from an analytics perspective and a data perspective. The one is be really clear about what your questions are, and then go and figure out what you need to be able to answer those questions. I think too often people will reverse that, and they'll go and they'll grab data or they'll start doing analysis without really a clear question in mind, which then leads to my second big recommendation, which is know when to stop. For analysts, they love the data, they love that process of doing the analysis, and there are so many rabbit holes that you can go down. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is drive business decisions. And a lot of times those business decisions are, I've hit a fork in the road, do I turn left or right? Well, I don't need to know with 100% accuracy whether to turn left or right. I need to know with 60 or 70% accuracy that left is much more likely to be profitable than right. And so once I've got that answer, I can stop. I can stop my analysis, I can make my recommendation, we can go act on it, and then I can go move on to the next question. And I think a lot of hours of analysts' time get burned in just going through this process of just like digging and digging and digging and digging until they've got 90 or 95% certainty. And honestly, like from a business perspective, you end up not needing that much. You just need to know which way is the wind blowing. Let's do enough analysis to know, okay, then we'll tack left or right as a result. How's that for mixing metaphors? I think I just took 3 different metaphors together.
It's okay. I'm also one for torturing metaphors, as anyone in the office can attest to. No, I really appreciate that. And I would agree too. I mean, I also make decisions with data, third-party data, even sometimes for our outreach. And I would agree. I would second that at some point, you definitely need to focus. If your real question is what's my market share, that's what you should be going towards, not everything that gets you there. And once you have that answer, growing it gets to be a little bit easier, and setting those goals seems to be a little bit more realistic and grounded.
Yeah. Related to that, I think understanding whether or not answering the question that you have is going to lead to any action. Are you going to be able to do something as a result of that? And if not, then what you have is literally trivia. If you have some analysis, some great finding that's really, really intriguing, but no one can do anything with it, no decisions change as a result of it, that's the definition of trivia. And that's not the business that we ought to be in.
Yeah, exactly. we're both in the actionable insights business. Keyword being actionable.
Yeah.
And the one last question, this is actually one I can help with, just a little bit more on everything that Earnest is offering. We've added a lot of things to our product suite, but basically want to know what exactly is our data suite right now. Cameron and I have been talking about data mostly based, or decisions mostly based on credit card and debit card transaction data, which is one of two large transaction data sets that we have as a company in our product. We also have a large geolocation data set, a CPG data set for select users, as well as web pricing on products from retailers, home builders, auto sellers, and a robust healthcare claims data set. All of these are essentially tracking real behavior of panels of millions of people in the US consumer economy. So that is the Earnest suite right now, available both on Earnest Direct, as well as our Earnest online platform called Earnest Dash, which you can try for free. So thanks, everyone. Great questions, and thanks for attending today's Earnest Talk. This was Cameron Alverson, Senior Director of Media and Analytics at Living Spaces Furniture, who led us through how transaction data is helping Living Spaces inform its store location and operation strategy and so much more. So thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time, Cameron.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Of course. Take care, everyone.